laboratories in Fort Collins. And one of the real important things that she does is she's in charge of plant preservation, but she's in charge of the plant preservation for species that can't be preserved just by seeds alone. Okay, and that's a really, apples are a pretty good example of this. And so how do we preserve these things? And so she's been a real leader of that, and also a leader just globally of thinking about what should our global strategy be for the conservation of apple and apple's native kind of origin, and so the species that our domesticated apple originated from in Pakistan. And it's a pleasure to have her here to talk more about her work. So, without further ado, I will open your presentation, Gayle, and yeah, please come up here.
That's it.
So thank you, Gayle.
So thank you for this opportunity to talk about some of our research that we've been doing for almost 20 years now, relating to apple conservation and the preservation and conservation of other crops. I'm going to start with some work with describing what the USDA plant collections are about, and then go into more of apple history and some of the genetics and genomics work that we're doing at Apple. I don't have time today to talk about all of the cool wild species and some of these international efforts that we're involved in, but that's available for questions. So I just stuck some fun quotes up here that were taken from the historic archives up in Fort Collins. I'm sure this is working. And you can see that it's been a long history, as Jude said, and it's as early as, 1878, we had apple trees growing up in Fort Collins that were documented in the newspaper. Going into the USDA program, we're part of the National Plant Germplasm System. I'm with the National Laboratory for Genetic Resources Preservation, which is one unit of that system here in the United States. Okay, so you can see Colorado and Fort Collins, and that's where we have our base collection of seeds and where we cryopreserve and conserve materials from all these other locations. All the other places on this map are places that are part of our national system. We have over 600,000 accessions of plants and their wild relatives that are important to agriculture. This is horticulture as well as seed crops, and vegetables and oil seeds and tubers and tropicals, pretty much anything you can think of that we grow here in the country. We have those main cultivars as well as the wilds relating to them and the resources here for plant breeding. So primarily it's for breeders who need access to novel germplasm so that they can create new crops that are more amenable to the way we grow things now. The collection that's most relevant for us today is the one way over there in New York State in Geneva, and that's where we have our apples. So that's that reference collection of apples that Jude and others have referred to. As I said, we're in Fort Collins, the National Laboratory for Genetic Resources Preservation. Our building is actually located on the CSU campus. And there's about 600,000 accessions. There's a lot of materials. It's a library of seeds. We keep most of them in cold storage, but we also have them in liquid nitrogen for long-term storage of some difficult materials. We also serve as a resource for materials to be stored from a lot of other gene banks around the world. We have the rice collection from the Philippines. We have summit collections of wheat and maize from Mexico. We have these huge international collections that send them to us as a backup of their collection to make sure that these genetic resources for the world are secure. And we really serve as a world resource, not just a US resource. So this is some pictures from inside our facility. The one on the left is our -18-degree freezer storage. This is where most of the seeds live. And the one on the right is our liquid nitrogen vapor and liquid nitrogen storage, where we've got some oil seeds. And the important part here is that we have apples in long-term storage. So we've actually cryopreserved dormant budwood for over 2,200 different kinds of apple cultivars that are in our national collection, and we've got them safe and secure in long-term storage. When we want to pull them out, we can warm these things up. These dormant buds can be rehydrated, and then there's a picture of a grafted apple tree with a dormant bud on it that came out of liquid nitrogen that is now regenerated. So this is a national resource that we have to secure our national collections. Okay, this is a picture of the apple trees in Geneva, New York. This is our national apple collection with over 2,300 different kinds of cultivars of apple. This represents modern varieties, historic varieties, cider varieties, crab varieties, a lot of things, pretty much anything you could think of, except the ones that people wish we had that we don't have. We also have over 1,500 seedlings from wild species. So these are materials that people have gone out in the wild from all over the world, collected these wild species of apples, brought those seeds back into the country, and now we have representatives of those growing in our national collection. Again, this is for us to learn more about the taxonomy and the biology of these really unusual, sometimes wild species of apple, and to make them available for breeding programs and for research. We also have about 1,500 seed accessions. These would be the rest of the seeds that came in from these wild trips. So these aren't special cultivars, these are species diversity samples that we keep in this collection in cold storage. So where do apples come from? Well, most of the apple species of the world are native to China. There's about 30 different species of apple. A lot of these are like the crab apple types. They're not your domesticated eating apple types, but they are found in the wild in China. The progenitor, or what we believe is the primary progenitor of the domesticated apple, is the Malus sibiricii, and it's a wild species in Kazakhstan, and that's that green apple kind of in the middle of the picture. So we think that these wild apples in Kazakhstan of Malus sibiricii introgressed in it and met different cultivars and different other wild species as people have been moving it around for thousands of years. So there's probably one line of domestication that took the apples from Kazakhstan into China. So there's old land races of China that are still perfectly nice eating apples, but they don't genetically look like our domestic Western type apples. Then there's other apples that went from Kazakhstan up into Russia. So these are old Russian varieties of apples. And those genetically, again, don't look the same as what our normal cultivars would look like, that we would mostly see in our grocery stores. The primary route that we believe for the Western apples that are more the international cultivars, and the ones that most people are familiar with, started with Malus sibiricii, and it headed westward to, and it introgressed perhaps some of Malus orientalis. That's a species native to Turkey and to Armenia and to Georgia. And then it continued to move along silk routes into Europe. And there was probably some integration with the wild European apples, which is Malus sylvestris. And from there, it's likely that ancient Europeans started to select and choose and determine some of these old varieties of apple. So the fun thing about apples is that they're colonially preserved. So we have apples that we have access to now that have been around for 1,000 years because people keep grafting them and making copies of them over and over again. So it's not like we're looking at the progenitors, we're actually looking at the same DNA compositions from some of these really original apples. So there was grafting taking place 5,000 BC in China, as well as some naturalized species of apples around 3,000 BC for these wild relatives in Europe and Central Asia. There's records of the Greeks grafting apples. And then as time progressed, the apple varieties moved into Europe, and there was a lot of storage of apples, or conservation and preservation and propagation of apples in Europe through the monasteries, and as cider started becoming really popular as a beverage. In fact, a lot of these European dessert apples, like Cox's Orange Pippin, that many, many people have heard of, it's one of the most popular apples still in Europe, was developed in the 1700s. So these apples that we're using now are actually often pretty old apples. There's a number of apples in our national collection that are from the 1700s and 1600s that are names that folks are actually familiar with. So this is the same genetics that have always been around. These cultivars just keep getting conserved and preserved and passed on. We did a project a few years ago where we were looking at nursery catalogs of apple varieties in the US. You can access a lot of nursery catalogs through some websites, at the National Ag Library, and we were looking at what varieties, kind of on a US basis, were the most common varieties that were getting sold and shipped in the 1800s. And we looked at some varieties that were before 1830s, and we wanted to know where did those primarily come from. So what was the apple stock that was coming into the US that became our heritage apples? And it turns out about 25% or so of the materials coming in were cultivars directly from the United Kingdom. There's also varieties coming in from Russia, from Germany, France, on boats. They were bringing trees, they were bringing cyanwood, they were bringing old varieties that they knew. But about half the varieties of these historic cultivars are actually our own cultivars. So these are more like the Johnny Appleseed type seedlings, or seedlings from these varieties that got brought in from Europe, that people selected, and they showed at their state fairs, and they got named, and they got grafted, and they got taken up by the nursery companies, and they were propagated, and they were sold throughout the country. So a lot of the material that we are talking about, these old historic varieties, they're actually old American varieties. And they might have, of course, they came from seeds that originated from somewhere else, because our native apples are not going to be cultivars that we need. But the actual genetic compositions that we call cultivars are American cultivars. So it's actually a burst in genetic diversity that happened as a result of people moving and planting apple trees around this country as it was developing. So here's just a quick slide summarizing that. Apple seeds came in from Europe. They were planted in dooryards and orchards. A lot of seeds got planted because it's a lot easier to bring seeds across the ocean than is trees. Every now and then, some desirable trees could be found, and those could get grafted. And a lot of the trees out there were just used for beverages or for ciders or for desserts, and they weren't necessarily your eating apples, but they were getting planted, and apples became a big part of the American landscape. Here's just my last picture on kind of the history of apples, and this is about the modern dessert apples. And again, most of the varieties we're seeing in the grocery stores, even Honeycrisp, it was from a cross made in 1974. So we're apples in breeding programs, it's all a very, very slow process. A lot of the material we're familiar with is not brand new cultivars that are coming hot off the press, except for Cosmic Crisp, or the new ones that are really, really fresh out of the breeding programs. But a lot of these, it's taken a long time for us to get to the point of having a cultivar that's actually presentable to the public and worth investing in from the growers. This is just an image of a journal cover that we had that was talking about the prevalence of these different varieties. And Ben Davis and Yellow Bellflower were the ones that we were seeing over and over and over again in a lot of these publications from the nursery catalogs. So those are ones that are pretty universally found across the country. And part of why we got into this is because we wanted to make sure that our national collection of apples actually represents important things for the whole country. So yeah, we may not have everything that Montezuma County has in our national collection, or we may not all have Boulder apples here, but we're looking at kind of on a more national basis, because we can't save everything at this point. We don't have the resources for that. But we want to make sure we've got the core heritage important ones that a lot of people can relate to. And that was kind of the purpose of our general survey across the country. And to make sure what we have, what we don't have, and if there's gaps that we need to fill in on a national scale. Another figure we have from that paper is we kind of split these different old heritage varieties into different priorities. Priority ones were the varieties that were really common, that we really should have preserved somewhere, somehow. Priority 2, 3, and 4 are the less common ones. So yeah, there's a lot of priority 4s, that like 500 or so, that we identified that we maybe don't have in our national collections. But at the same time, those are maybe more local ones, and those are the ones that would be perfect targets for community conservation programs to pick up and protect. And on a national scale, maybe we need to be looking at the priority 1 ones to say, what do we have? Well, we maybe have about half that we wish we had, and a lot of these are still available somewhere. And so from a national scale, we can be working with these other groups to try to make sure we kind of pick those up and have those available for the nation. Here's just one last picture relating to that project. And this is just showing what we have in our national collection. So we've got around 2,500 or so different cultivars that are grafted that we're protecting in the collection right now. And a lot of those, the ones that we have dates for, are the more recent releases. So those are from 1900 and some from 1800 and forward. And a lot of the reason is that we have so many of these 1900s apples is that we built our national collection in the 1980s. So this is not an ancient collection. This idea of collecting apple trees in the US is fairly recent. And at the time, it was built from breeding programs. So they reached out to breeding programs in the country and said, hey, what's your favorite stuff? What's your old stuff? We'll put that into a USDA national collection. And that's the way this collection started, and then now we continue to build this collection by adding wild species and by adding heritage varieties in. But we have to be really conscientious of the prices involved. So this is this reference collection that, that folks are talking about for the DNA. We have this collection of trees in upstate New York that lives in an orchard, and we can collect leaves from those and do DNA testing, and they have names associated with them, and we desperately hope those names are correct. Okay, so this is the reference set that, that folks have referred to today. It's got about 1,500 cultivars in it, sitting in this orchard in upstate New York, and that's a picture of the orchard. We also have some varieties, about 100 or so, from Seed Savers Exchange, that are varieties we don't have in our national collection, but we've worked with Seed Savers to say, you know, I think you've got some good stuff here, let's add it in, and we'll see how it compares it and what we'll end up doing with it. And then we've also had a collaborative project on ciders and cider varieties. So we had a number of accessions from the Washington State University cider collection. And 21 of those cultivars weren't available in either of these other two collections, so they're kind of designated the Washington cider varieties. So all in all, we've got about 1,600 or so cultivars in this reference set. And this is this named set of material that folks are referring to when they're saying, this identified as Ben Davis. It's because it matched one of these trees that's in this reference set. So what do we do? When we do this genetic fingerprinting work, we collect leaf samples and we extract their DNA. And then we can use, we can amplify that DNA through what we call a PCR. And then we can use a genetic sequencer to measure the size of these little pieces of DNA that we're amplifying. And then we essentially make a little barcode for each of the cultivars. So we've got 9 different regions, and we've got 2 samples, because there's 2 strands of DNA in these diploid type trees. So we've got essentially like 18 numbers. And that turns into the barcode that we're comparing unknown trees to our reference trees. So I have the reference barcode set that folks are comparing to. And that's because we've done all this genetic testing on our national collections. We first developed this barcode set back in the mid-2000s through a project that I'll talk about next. And we just keep building it. So folks say, you know, I really wish you had these varieties because they're really important to us. And so we say, sure, send us some reference material and we'll add it in. So we keep adding and we keep building. And we've been running these samples for folks for various projects for about 15 years now. So this is the first work, and this is the work that often people find and they contact us about. And it's some work that a graduate student down at the University of Arizona did in the mid-2000s and published it in 2009. And he looked at historic apple trees throughout the Four Corners area. So he worked a lot with Capitol Reef National Park. And if you go down there, there's a lot of apple orchards, and they have information about the old varieties in there, and that's all resulting from his master's work. And the main varieties that he was identifying in these places in the Southwest Corners area were Delicious and Grimes Golden and Jonathan and Rhode Island Greening and Winesap. And based on that paper, it's kind of blossomed into other projects that have tied into us. Just this year, we published some work looking at the apple trees of the state of Wyoming. So we've sampled hundreds of apple trees up in Wyoming from old ranches and nurseries and orchards and university farms and anything they could get their hands on. This is a collaboration with the University of Wyoming. And identify old historic cultivars. And I've got a list there on the right-hand side if you are interested in their most popular cultivars up in Wyoming. By far and away, it's Wealthy. Wealthy grows really well under Wyoming climates. We found it throughout the state, and we're very proud of it. But these other ones are also interesting ones, and folks up in Wyoming are interested in growing these as specialty crops, as farmers market crops, or as developing some heritage farms and orchards of their own for the purposes of protecting old Wyoming varieties. So it's kind of fun that we're kind of collecting these conservation groups throughout the country, actually, that want to preserve their local apple history. One big project I'm involved in now, and I've been doing this for a few years now, is working with Yosemite National Park and Redwoods National Park and El Dorado National Forest. And most of the work has been with Yosemite because they've got hundreds of apple trees that in 8 historic orchards. And we've been trying to help them figure out what their trees are, what they're going to conserve, and how they're going to do this. Usually they're interested in conserving the natural resources, but these apples are also part of their heritage, and it's a big deal for them. They've lost 2 of their orchards in the past 5 years as a result of forest fires. So thankfully we actually had genotyped those trees before the fires came through, so we either know what they lost, or we can replace what they lost because it's available somewhere else. But the other big problem that they have is the bears. And a lot of their orchards are in the valley, in the Yosemite Valley, and that's exactly where the campgrounds are, and where the public is, and where the tourists are, and that's where the bears are. And they don't want the bears down in the valley with the apple trees in the fall. So it's a really expensive project to take all these apples off these old trees and get the apples out of there so the bears stay away. And it's actually the wildlife folks that I work with at Yosemite. So we're in the process of figuring out what trees they have, whether they're conserved elsewhere, or whether we need to be developing some conservation orchards even within the national park to try to save those varieties that, again, aren't in our national collections. We don't know what they are, but there's multiple copies of them, so somebody grafted them and somebody planted them a long time ago. Here's some more pictures of Yosemite, of some of the orchards, just right down in the middle of the valley. Here's some pictures I took this past September when I was there. Again, this is an orchard right in the valley. It's a beautiful lemon orchard, but the trees are in really pitiful condition. And in fact, a lot of this data, these samples were collected in 2012, and now that we've gone back 5, 6, 7 years later, half the trees are dead. So we're losing trees so fast right now, and that's why it's become such an urgent thing for them to figure out what we're going to do, because if they do nothing, which is what they're doing right now, they will lose them. And it's become a park priority. Here's another one of their problem orchards. This one's in a parking lot. So the orchard was planted in like the 1880s, and in the 1930s they put a parking lot in this beautiful flat spot in between all the apple trees. And so now we have these horrible apple trees that are all falling apart, dropping branches, causing problems with bears, and we have cars parked among them. So the park is trying to figure out, is there some way we can save parts and pieces of this, or conserve some of these trees elsewhere so we save the diversity but still make it a positive visitor experience. Here's an example of cultivars that we found at Yosemite. I'm not going to read off all the names, but a lot of these are some of the more common and sometimes less common varieties of apples of the West. Thankfully, of the ones we found in the park, most of them are available in our USDA collection already that we could name. And we had 19 different types that we were pretty sure are cultivars and not seedlings, but they aren't necessarily known what they are. So those varieties are, we're looking at conserving them first within the park. This is just a slide. I don't even think I'm going to talk about most of this, but I want to say that sometimes this appearance identification doesn't necessarily come up with the same answers as what genotyping does with the DNA. And so we got a lot of feedback saying it's not right because I know it's this kind of tree and your DNA samples didn't tell me that. And so we have to look at the data, and I'm just reporting the data, and that's all I'll ever do. But it's a really subjective, sometimes, project to identify apple trees based on appearance. The fingerprinting is one step better. Currently we're moving into what they call snip chip fingerprinting, which is a lot more markers, and we're getting our national collection using these about 20,000 markers instead of just 9. And then we can have a much more concrete answer as far as what these cultivars are, and we can compare our varieties with international collections. Okay, here's a quick picture of old orchards up in Fort Collins. And here's historic waterworks in Fort Collins. We genotyped some local trees as a side project a few years ago, so we have our own local orchard that we're excited about. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about is this global apple conservation project. Worldwide, apples are produced by only a few cultivars. It's 10 to 20 cultivars you're going to see in most grocery stores. Locally, there are other kinds, but on an international trading scale, it's really 10 or 20 dominant types. And all of these varieties are vulnerable to diseases and to pests and to pathogens and environmental threats. So we need to be having access to these wilds and to other types of apple varieties for the breeders to use this material for the future. These collections that we have are expensive. There's a lot of quarantine. It's difficult to move varieties around. And that's why we're looking at this on a global scale to figure out what all the different countries have and what we would want to do with that. So we're looking at, there's dozens of apple collections around the world. We've documented what they have. We're developing databases to share this information based on their genetic information and their history information. And this global plan for apple is also going to include these local collections as well, because we recognize that these big collections that are the national collections are going to be very widespread, but there's important local diversity too. So we're trying to find a place in this global plan to have the smaller community orchards be involved. So there's a link down there. There's a copy of this global strategy for apple that just came out in September, and there's a link to it online. And I'll just finish off with a token of our apple collaborators that we've been involved with over the years.
Thanks, Gayle. I want to just transition now to the panelists, and we'll have open questions after that with the panelists. And so, we've invited 4 panelists that I just think are just really amazing kind of community experts on many different kind of aspects of apples. And so I'd like to invite them up. And then I would also like to invite Karen Collins up. I've asked her to moderate the panel. So Karen is a professor in the Environmental Studies Department at University of Colorado. And he is the director of the Center for Sustainable Landscapes and Communities. And they are the kind of the center that the Boulder Apple Tree Project is housed under. So these kind of initiatives, like with apple trees, the center also does these similar types of things, really working to get CU researchers, students, and community members involved in other aspects of our community, such as fire, such as land use, such as urban forestry. There's a lot of other projects, so I urge you to look into those if you're interested. Okay, Karen, please.
Well, why don't we have the panelists join us up here? I'll do a quick introduction. As you're getting seated, I just wanted to note we do have a little postcard out on one of the tables for the Center for Sustainable Landscapes and Communities, and I would encourage you to check out our website. That URL is not yet active. It's like days away from being active by the University of Colorado. It's a new website. But we really are focused on engaging the community in research, education, and outreach regarding a whole host of issues, as Katie said. So I'm really pleased to be participating in this Boulder Apple Tree Project Symposium. I think it's a wonderful celebration of our apple legacy and of all the wonderful questions that can be asked by students and faculty and community members. So I'll do a quick introduction in the interest of time. You have the bios of each of these panelists in your program. And then I'll start with a question for each of them, and then we'll open it up to some audience questions as well. So first of all, we have Daniel Haken from Haken Family Ciders. Dan, along with his wife Talia, founded Haken Family Cider in 2018, and they have won numerous awards for their ciders. I'm sure Daniel will tell you a little bit more about that. Eric Johnson is a co-founder of Widespread Malice, one of the most clever names for an organization that I have ever run across, which is a Boulder community organization aimed at apples and local agriculture. We have Scott Scoberbo, did I say that correctly? Who knows heritage apples very well. He's run his own edible plant nurseries for several years and is now at the Fort Collins Wholesale Nursery. And then Hannah Terrell-Wasaki, Executive Director for Community Fruit Rescue, which organizes neighborhood harvests where fruit is harvested by volunteers and then the fruit is shared. And so I am so honored to have you all here. I want to start with the same question for each of you, and then I have some specific questions. And I want to note that these questions were generated by the students that Katie's been teaching and her graduate students have been teaching this fall. But the first question is sort of a softball here for each of you, and we'll start with Scott. What do you think are the biggest values of locally grown heritage apples, and how can we get more people to know about them?
Well, I'd say that the greatest value of locally grown apples is adaptability. The perfect example is Red Delicious apple. You know, that's one that Jude was saying is planted, top grafted over all these old varieties. Well, right up the road in Cheyenne, Wyoming, which is, 35 minutes from where I live in Fort Collins, they tested 1,500 apple varieties for local adaptability, and the Red Delicious apple lived, but you know how many pounds of fruit it averaged yield every year? 1 pound. It just was not adaptable for, 1,000 foot more elevation, 6,000 foot elevation. But just like anything, there's local conditions that apples really respond to. So, what was the second part?
And how do we get more people to know about these values of these apples, these heritage apples?
Well, that's a really good question. The first thing is to have programs such as this and to talk about it. I know a lot about apples, and I came away jazzed. Hearing Jude's talk, it was like, oh my God, I want to get that one too. It's just amazing. And so that's what we have to do. I've been growing apple trees and nursery plants. I've grown 5 million trees in my life. And I've grown so many trees that nobody buys. And so they end up being thrown away. And so what do you grow it first and then try to talk? Or do you get people jazzed about it and then you don't have it available? So you kind of have to go to get them available first and then try to do the promotion on it. That's what I think.
Great, why don't you pass it along? Thank you, Eric.
I guess what comes to mind for me is that local heritage varieties will come in a spectrum of different harvest times and uses. And so instead of Red Delicious, we have summer apples that are, some of the first tree fruits, well, first pomes anyway, that you can get off of a tree, and you haven't had maybe a good apple for a few months. You can get a fresh, right off the tree apple in August. That's pretty cool, and it's not going to be Red Delicious. And then, not just the timing, because we can have apples that we're picking in November if the weather holds, but also different uses. So there are some apples that really aren't that great as eating apples. There are apples that are great as eating apples. There are apples that are great as pie apples, baking apples. There are ones that are especially good for drying. Maybe they're low moisture, but they still have a lot of sugars in them. Ones that are good for making applesauce, and so on. And the national distributed varieties that are in the commodity stream just don't have those qualities. Right? Some of them may be good for one thing or another, but you'll never be able to get the specificity that you can get from the local apples that were known in your area. So that's my thought as far as what values they might bring. They also have cultural and historical values, and so we might celebrate. Maybe they have a Gravenstein Apple Festival in Sonoma County in California, and we could have a Colorado Orange one or something, and so on like that. As far as how we bring them to people. One very good place is through farmers markets. And the smaller growers who are doing diverse operations, fruits and vegetables, and who want to set up a nice market stand at the farmers market each week, might be able to showcase a fruit that you will never find anywhere else. For example, here on the front range, if you go to the farmers markets and look for Masonville orchards, which I think is now, oh, they're still doing that, but the U-pick is a different operation now. Is that right?
We bought them out next season.
Okay.
Sorry.
Sorry.
They will not.
Someone will do this like Masonville Orchards has done in the past. Walt Rosenberg at Masonville Orchards offers some 200 kinds of signwood and many cultivars historically had in his farmers market business. And there's a U-pick that is sort of...
You can still drink his apples.
Yeah, there you go. So the possibility is really there, and he had worked out a pretty cool niche for, by selling signwood, by selling in the local markets, to be able to have a very diverse operation. He also grows in 5 different orchards that are different elevations out on the plains, up in the foothills, and so on. And so he's able to get a crop most years when, if you just have something right, say, in Boulder or up in the foothills or out on the plains, maybe the weather's not good and that crop is lost. Anyway, farmers markets are a huge thing, and I think there's a lot of opportunity for those sort of celebratory events, maybe like the event you guys had in North Boulder Park a few weeks ago, or apple tastings. That kind of thing.
Great, thank you.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I'll just second what my fellow panelists have said for sure. And I also think part of the value is just that people get really excited about them. I think that's what we see the most from our perspective with Community Fruit Rescue is when people know that they have a rare tree or a unique tree, they get really excited. And so that kind of also speaks to the second part of the question, which is just that, you know, because they are unique and it's not just, you know, your regular store-bought apple, people kind of flock to it. So often when we have a harvest coming up and we're able to say, like, we know this is maybe, you know, an Arkansas black harvest or whatever it is, and we're really guessing, kind of. So, but people will come out for that because it's really interesting to them. And so, yeah, I think honestly, in order to share this knowledge and to really get the word out there about all these different types, what we're really promoting is this community level of sharing knowledge. So neighbors coming together and picking the tree on the corner. You know, community members coming out and picking the tree that's owned by maybe an elder in town who can't pick it themselves, and learning about different varieties of cultivars that way.
We think about apples, we value apples for cider making. And when I think about cider, we make cider the same way that winemakers make wine, with 2 ingredients, fruit and yeast. In our case, the fruit is an apple, not a grape, but we think apples are capable of everything grapes are. They're the wine grape that you just don't know about. They can be light, bright, and refreshing, or tannic, earthy, and complex, and anything in between. They're exceptional, and I'm going to kind of stretch that analogy to answer the second part of that question. Think about how people value grapes. When they drink them, they know the region they come from. They know the farmer that grew it. They knew the year it was grown, the varietal, maybe even where that grape originally came from. They know everything. But when they eat a grape, all they know is the color. They don't care about it when they eat it. It's our contention and kind of what we're doing as a company to say people really, really care about it, and it shows up in a champagne bottle, and it's a drink. And I guess, you know, from our company, what we're saying, or at least the walk we're walking is, we're saying if you really want people to care about this fruit, drink it, don't eat it.
I'm going to grab this and then keep that. All right, so I heard a lot of great answers to those questions. Adaptability, the value of local heritage apples, adaptability and breadth of use and growing season. community pride and individual pride, and then put it in a glass. So those are wonderful. Okay, I have a question for Hannah. The apples that are collected by Community Fruit Rescue are primarily from residential areas. Are there certain trees that you favor for these harvests? And how many apples are collected and where do they go?
Great. So there are definitely trees that produce better than others, better tasting fruit, better quality, more fruit, easier to pick. So there certainly are trees that we get more excited about, but because part of what we're doing, part of our mission is also to protect wildlife, and we heard a little bit about bears in apple trees in our last presentation, but that's also a big thing here in Boulder. And so we will still harvest trees even if they aren't really great quality, eating apples for humans, because we want to reduce those attractants to wildlife and get them, away from where the bears could be lured into town. So, and those apples we'll donate as livestock feed or to the wild animal sanctuary, something along those lines. So, while there are, favorite trees for sure, we'll still pick all of them. And then, how many apples? That's a great question. I have no idea how many apples. We measure it in pounds. So since we started, we've rescued over 45,000 pounds. And we also measure it in servings that are provided. So it's over 180,000 servings of fruit since we started in 2014. And what was the last one?
So where are those going?
Yeah, so depending on the quality of the fruit, they go different places. So the really perfect A-grade fruit we'll donate to places where they're going to eat it fresh or give it out fresh, like Harvest of Hope, the Boulder Homeless Shelter, Community Food Bank are a few of the places that we donate to. Boulder Valley School District actually takes some for their walk and bike to school day. They hand them out as incentives. And then our B quality fruit is fruit that may need to be chopped up to chop a blemish out or something, but there's still a ton of good fruit there. That goes to places where they can process it and turn it into applesauce or dehydrated fruit snacks or cider. And we're always looking for more partners for that kind of thing. And then, like I mentioned before, we also will take that C quality fruit that no one's really going to eat, but an animal would still eat. And so we partner with Black Cat Farm and 63rd Street Farm, and also the Wild Animal Sanctuary in Keensburg to get that fruit out to them.
Wonderful. So contributing to the problem of wasted food, contributing to the problem of human-wildlife interactions via bears. So that's really wonderful. Scott, I have a question for you. I understand you have an amazing story about how you found the last tree planted by Johnny Appleseed. Can you share that with us? Can you pass the microphone, please?
Well, let me just point out, I actually brought a specimen here with me. Not the Johnny Appleseed tree, though, but it was this tree that led me to start thinking about it. I had started my nursery straight out of CSU, degree in horticulture, and I found in the USDA collection in Geneva, they had an apple called the Flower of Kent. And then they had, in parentheses, the Isaac Newton apple. And at that time, it was before the internet, so I had to call them up, and they said, oh, that tree came from the tree that Isaac Newton was sitting under in 1665, gave him the idea of the law of gravity. And so, can I get a piece of that? I said, sure, you paid for it, taxpayer money. So they sent it to me, and this is it.
All right.
And so that's what really started turning me on. I always loved history, because what is history but it's French for a story? And so that's what it was, so the story, and I started thinking, well, there's got to be more. So I went looking for that last tree, Johnny Appleseed, and this is before Michael Pollan's book of, The Botany of Desire, where it was known that Johnny Appleseed's trees were mostly made into cider, hard cider. And because they didn't have refrigeration, it allowed them to have, drink that was protected by the alcohol in there to survive the winter. The problem was that because they were seedling trees from seedling trees, they kind of reverted back to nothing really special. And as the years went by from Johnny Appleseed, trees being planted starting in like 1806 to 1842, they died of old age. But I thought, so surely somebody must have propagate this. He was in Walt Disney movies, Somebody should have done it. So I just kept looking and looking, and finally I had a breakthrough, and it was a book called The Book of Apples, an English pomology book, and it had one paragraph of Johnny Appleseed in there. It said, one tree was still alive in Ashland County, Ohio, as late as 1961. This was like 1990, and I thought, that's not that long. That was only 30-some years before it. Maybe it's still around. It gave me the county, and to make a long story short, it turns out that it was a librarian who kept a file. And she said, oh, that tree, oh, yeah, I'm sorry it died in 1965. But the man whose farm it was on, he's still alive. Maybe he knows if anybody took cuttings. So he gave me his phone number. I called him up, and he gets on the phone and says, hello! He was really super old. I learned out later that he was 92. And he said, oh, yeah, they did take some cuttings. Hey, Dorothy, get the scrapbook out. His wife was still alive. And she came out and got the scrapbook and said, yes, here it is. It was a school, 7th grader from a Brunswick Middle School up near Cleveland. That was my hint. So I called the school districts, found wild goose chase after wild goose chase. Back when the long distance was expensive, I had a $300 phone bill. And I found the teacher. She didn't remember the name of the student, but she remembered who she gave it to. And so I called the man up, and he still had it in his backyard. So I was able to get the tree. And the other man, old-timer's name was Roy Funk. I called him back and said, do you mind if I could get this? Could I get the copies from your scrapbook? He goes, oh, I'm 92 years old. I don't know how to use the Xerox machine. So I'll just send you the scrapbook if you promise to send it back. So he sent this valuable scrapbook with newspaper articles, photographs, all of these notes. A front page article in the Cleveland Plain Dealer in 1961, the last tree of Johnny Appleseed. And I was able to get historical documentation and got cuttings from the man who had saved it from the 7th grader. So what's the moral of the story is that we think somebody else is going to do it. And in that generation, in 1961, when the last tree of Johnny Appleseed was in the front page of Ohio's #1 newspaper, who did something about it? The 7th grader.
Oh, what a great story. So, I'm going to ask you.
There's one that had been misplaced. That's why nobody answered it, I guess. The person on the other end said Ken Morris. Anybody here by that name?
Oh, okay. I know who that is.
You do? Okay.
Yep.
Thank you. All right, a couple more questions, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience and also invite our other speakers up. A question for Dan. So you mentioned grapes and how much we as a culture pay attention to grapes once they're in the bottle, where they came from and where they were grown and by whom. So I want to ask you about terroir, the idea of the influence of place on a product. Have you noticed a pattern in the environments which produce, in your opinion, the best cider apples? And if so, what are they? Are they in the coldest places or the highest places or the kind of middle of the road places? What do you notice about that interaction between the variety and the environment?
So the word best implies some opinion, and my opinion is the best apples are grown in Colorado. Full stop. But the predictability of the weather is a completely separate issue. So despite the fact that we have late frosts in the spring, early frosts in the fall, and then hail and cottle and moth in between the two, when it works, it's absolutely fantastic. And the reason why our fruit is different, among the reasons, is our unique climate and the place where we are. It's the term the French put on it is terroir. It's basically how does the place affect how the beverage tastes eventually. And some of the amazing things about our weather is, and I think this was mentioned earlier, is massive deviations between daytime high and nighttime lows. So that difference is huge. The bigger the difference, more sugar production, more intense flavor production. This is also a very dry climate. Apples actually breathe on the tree, and just like us, they exhale water. So we get really concentrated fruit here that oftentimes is much smaller depending on how it was grown than you would expect in a grocery store fruit, but you can't see that in your glass. All that's in your glass is the taste of the place. Additionally, a very famous cider maker said this to me one time, and I think it's right on. He said, some of the absolute best apples in the world are grown right on the border of where it's easy to grow and where it's impossible to grow. Meaning, stress the fruit. And there's some scientific indication that this is true. Stressed fruit produces more antioxidants. And I don't think it's simply one chemical compound. You can taste the difference. Same cultivar, I would never use an apple grown in standard commercial methods from a standard region because it's just not as interesting. And so, just like wine grapes, they don't plant them in potting soil. They plant them in a place where they have to struggle and work really, really hard to yield a small amount of exceptional fruit. A lot of winemakers are trying to minimize their yield per acre because they know it maximizes quality. So, ironically, all of the stuff that makes our region a difficult place to grow fruit is exactly what makes it so delicious.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you. All right, so question for Eric. You talked about how people are beginning to bring some of these historic cultivars to farmers markets and educate the public about what's available. I'm curious if you think that there are any newly found cultivars that could be grown on the current apple market and would be more popular, and maybe at what scale? Is that still sort of regional within Colorado or the state of Colorado, or marketable even more broadly? What are your thoughts on that?
I think the best answer I could give would be to just defer to Jude right here and Addie, who've done some incredible work on that. I mean, you all have located some seedlings that have real promise for a variety of uses, and so those things are definitely out there. Now, I have one or two of those maybe, but and our orchards are not producing yet, so we can't speak as to the flavor of different things. But I will say this: in the running around town, seeing an apple tree overhanging the sidewalk and tasting things, or some of the trees that we surveyed in the BioBlast a year ago in the fall, boy, I tasted some great stuff that I'm pretty sure seedlings. I mean, I can think of a tree that has some real potential for cider because it's got a significant amount of astringency in it, but it's fairly sweet too. And that thing is growing like 6 inches from a sidewalk. And there's no way somebody planted that tree there. There's just no way. And it's on the outside of the fence, so it's something somebody dropped. Or one that's out by Boulder Reservoir that is a wonderful hard apple. Now, we happened to have tasted it in September, so I don't know how long it lasts. But it was a very hard apple, a lot of sugar, plenty of acidity. It just was really exploding with flavor. And that one in particular, I have already gotten signwood off of, and I'm propagating. So what I would say for us around here, as we begin to locate those local cultivars, the way we're going to do it is by tasting old trees and tasting trees on the side of the road. We will locate some incredible things that way. And I have not, it's not like I've tasted millions of apples from millions of trees. I haven't. So you will find some really yummy stuff just by walking around, and on that one day you're out on the trail and there's an apple there. That might be something really good. So taste every apple.
I love that. And then when you do, get in touch with Katie. Tell her where that tree is.
And let me know too, because I'll.
And let Eric know too. Okay, great, thank you. So Jude and Addie and Gayle, can you also come up? And we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Maybe you can pull 3 chairs up here. And we have a couple of folks circulating with microphones, or I'm going to give you the microphone. How's that going to work, Katie?
Yeah, so they can give, so if you want a question, then
Yes, here we've
get in
got
touch with some of the team on the
Chris
side,
and Irfan.
yeah, and
Okay.
they'll give you a microphone, okay?
Great, so don't be shy. Questions for this amazing group of people up here. We've got one back here.
When I think of related fruit, the first thing that comes to mind are pears. So is pears also something that are grown in Colorado? And it's also, is there an event like this for pears?
Great question. Who wants to take that one? Would you?
So after Spencer Beach Road, Apples of New York, the agricultural station there went into UP Hedrick, became in charge of it. He went on to write Cherries of New York, Pears of New York, Peaches of New York, Grapes of New York, Small Fruits of New York. When you read Pears of New York, he starts off saying, pears are one of God's great mysteries. That kind of explains pears. There were a lot of pears grown across Colorado. Pears take a long time to grow and develop. They can sit there for years and do nothing, and then suddenly they'll start to do something. A lot of the pear cultivars that used to exist still exist now. There was never as much genetic diversity with pears as there are with apples. The other problem that was with pears, especially here on the Front Range, is they are more susceptible to fire blight. When an apple is in bloom, maybe 40 to 60% of an apple is in bloom at a time. When a pear is in bloom, 80 to 90% of it is in bloom at a time. So if you guys have a pear fully in bloom and you get a warm rain shower going through in the spring, a thunderstorm, that sets it up for catastrophic instant fire blight death.
Very interesting. I love pears, actually. Another question from the audience. There we go. We have a couple right here. You can speak into the microphone. Thank you.
Okay. Definitely new world technologically. A question for Jude. When you were showing your slides, you went past rather quickly a slide of a small red fleshed apple. What is that?
We haven't named that yet. It's a little seedling there from Dolores. It's a great little apple, red flesh, raspberry kind of flavor to it, has red blossoms. This is Luther Burbank's leak genetics. If the flesh is red, the flower is red, the cambial layer is red, and that's exactly that tree. So it was just a seedling there.
Thanks.
We had one right here. Right. Yeah, there you go.
This thing is very weird. I'm wondering, Daniel, all these, trees on the side of the road and all that, how many apples, what percentage of your stock comes from Colorado apples, and does any of it come from these kind of, these weird places that everybody's discovering?
So that's a moving target. We launched our business. We're just finishing pressing our 3rd harvest. So we don't know how big we're going to be yet, and we're getting better at sourcing fruit all the time. So in year 1, 100% came from Colorado. We bought our building, demolished everything, and then we had a late frost, and we knocked out the whole harvest in Colorado. So that was an important lesson that I think is probably good that we learned earlier on. We have one grower in Yakima Valley, Washington. So having an insurance policy allows us to showcase Colorado fruit. So what we say is as much as possible. If we get it here, we'll get it here first before we ever buy it from out of state. And the good news is I'm starting to meet some young orchardists who are planting trees. Most of the ones I was buying from before were older or multi-generational. So it's encouraging to see this kind of event about apples. It makes me very hopeful that 10, 20 years from now, the answer could be, in most good years, easily 100%. That's what I want. Now, in terms of the side of the road, I love to forage in season, love. So I drive around with the sugar measuring device called a refractometer, and anytime I see a tree, I pull over right away and check the sugar level, and if it's good and it smells good, this giant tarp, this really long pole, it should be hot and see how apples fall down. And I do that as much as I can. It's really obviously hard to justify commercially, but it's fun, and it's what I'm passionate about, and really all I want is the best fruit, and I don't care where it is, I'm gonna go find it. So if it's growing out of a sidewalk, or open spaces, or whatever, I want to showcase the absolute best apples. I think the best apples are here, and many, many, many of them are seedlings. And if they're not seedlings, many of them are unique cultivars. There's so much to recommend this kind of endeavor. None of it is commercially viable, but I love it. And one of the coolest things about it is, so I found an apple. There were 2 trees, important 2 trees means humans put it there. And the tree is probably more than 100 years old, and the trees are around 100 years old. They're amazing. They're clearly not planted for eating because they're not eating quality. They were planted and somebody made cider out of that a century ago. Then we all collectively forgot and just ignored the tree. And bears ate it for 50 years or 70 years or however long we've been ignoring that tree. And then I come walking by and I can make cider out of that tree. It's like an awesome time warp. You can taste. It's I don't know, it's like a multi-generational farm-to-table thing. Like it gives you this connection to the place. And apples were super regional. So what people esteemed and they kept in one region, in one place, is so radically different than somewhere else. So being able to forage fruit from old trees in Boulder and then pour it for people in Boulder is a really, really cool part of what we do. It's a very small part of what we do, but it's probably my favorite thing. It's what I love doing as a hobbyist, and we weren't too good for side-of-the-road apples then, and we're not too good for them now.
Eric, do you want to comment on that question as well?
Well, it's certainly true that of the thousands and thousands of cultivars that have been known and originated in North America, many, many of those are chance seedlings that, they're Johnny Appleseed trees or they're whatever, seedling rootstock that the top died and the thing still sprout or whatever like that. And somebody tasted them and they liked them and propagated them. There's an awful lot of stuff that happens that way. If you read in any of the apple histories or that big Dan Bussey 7-volume work, they will tell the history of the apple if they know it. And an awful lot of a chance seedling found on the farm of so-and-so in 1845. A lot of that happens. Now today, I know it's the case that, through my own experience, but I also watch it happen. There's quite a lot of apple aficionado activity on social media, and Facebook in particular is what I have seen. And there's informal networks of people that are trading apple material all over the United States all the time. Also through Seed Savers Exchange, which Dan Bussey was affiliated with. And for example, Six Finger Jack, which you guys identified from down your way, I got a sign from you guys a few years ago, and then I listed it on my Seed Savers Exchange profile. Somebody from West Virginia, I think it was West Virginia, sent me an email or something that said I'd really like to get a hold of that, and somebody else knows about this thing. And so I sent him a copy, and it turns out that he had read or met you guys or something like that, and was very interested in this particular tree for cider. So at this, people are trading apples all over the place, and this is definitely true for cider makers as well.
Great, thank you. It looks like we have time for one more question. There's one right over there.
So I have a question about coddling laws. 2 bad words, yeah, boo. And I'm wondering if anyone knows how widespread they are in the orchards in Colorado, and does anybody want to tell me how you deal with them? Have any suggestions?
They're just in your trees.
I know.
All right, who would like to take that question about coddling laws? Eric, Scott? Okay, Scott, let me hear from you first.
Well, this is what I believe, is that unless you really want to spray pesticides on them, which I never do. You have to just kind of live with it. But there are some things that you can do that will reduce the numbers. The first thing is I was talking to Pagnotti from the Denver Botanic Gardens, and he was telling me, you know this European paper wasp that's now all over the place? They have done more to reduce codling moth damage than just about anything else because they feed on the larvae. And so that kind of made a lot of sense because I've noticed reduced amounts of codling moth damage to my home orchard. And the second thing that I recommend doing is to put corrugated cardboard around the base, the trunk of your tree, and you put the corrugation part on the inside by the trunk, and what happens is that then the codling moths, the larvae will go down there and pupate. And you know who eats them? Earwigs. So the things that you think that are these horrible things that are eating your fruit trees, they're really not. They're some of the best predators. And so you just go in there and you can do one or two things. You can then take the corrugated out and just shake the earwigs off and then throw away the pupated codling moth pupas and put new corrugated cardboard around the edges, and that works pretty darn well. There's another thing that they've talked about is that they talk about booties, like little nylon booties, and they sell them like in fruit growing societies in the Pacific Northwest. And they found that that's mostly good for the for other types of worms that infect the apples. But if you spray that, put the booty over the fruit that's just starting to develop, and then there's a clay called surround, and you spray the surround on the booty, that's almost 100% effective organically at preventing the codling moth from infecting that tree, that particular fruit.
I've tried the bags, they just go right to the bag, so that you can protect them with surround.
Yeah, the surround, and it's like a clay material that you just spray on it. Yeah, kaolin clay.
You want to add to that?
Sure, yeah, just briefly, I would say that employing a variety, hitting it several different ways, hitting the problem several different ways is important. For surround, it's helpful to, it'll wash off to some extent with the rains, and so you may need to reapply it, but also those larvae are only looking to get inside the fruit at certain times of the summer, so there are different generations, sometimes 2, maybe generations of codling moths, maybe 3. And by setting up pheromone, you can buy these traps at the Guckin Hardware here. Setting these traps up in your orchard and observing them to see when you start getting codling moths stuck on there. And you can also do some modeling with weather data. You can pretty accurately predict when these things are going to be active, and that's when you want to have sprayed the surround a day or two before. And you can get very high levels of control from that. In addition, it's worth, in some cases there might be some value in doing these pheromone lures that are confusion lures. There's some kind of mating pheromone for the codling moth that you can buy a synthesized version of it and deploy it in your orchard, and they can't find one another to mate. There's some limitations on that as far as what scales it's appropriate for and whether you're just attracting more in and different things like that. But then also having a diverse amount of small flowered plants that are flowering, and I mean, a sunflower is a small flowered plant, right? It has lots of little blossoms in there, it's a composite. Lots of flowering plants throughout the season is helpful because that's habitat for some of the predatory insects or parasitizing insects that the adults need nectar, and it's the offspring before they pupate into adults, different wasps and things that are effective against the codling moth larvae. So.
Well, thank you. Well, our time is up for the panel. I'd like to thank all the panelists again. Thank you so much. To hang around for a few minutes and answer questions and have conversations. So I'm going to turn it back over to Katie.
Yes, thanks. Just really quickly, I'd like to just make sure to thank all the CU students that came, had the guts to show all the exciting research that they've done. The posters are still out if you want, so please, please join me to certainly thank all our speakers and panelists. There's a huge wealth of knowledge here, and so I'm sure they're willing to continue discussions. If you want to come and ask specific questions, please do, but thank you all. And then just lastly, so I hope you had a kind of got a good idea about what we're trying to do with the Boulder Apple Tree Project. We will send out a survey asking about what you're interested in terms of getting involved, in terms of preserving trees, or learning how to graft, or how we can really get the community involved in these next steps. So please just take some time, give us some feedback, and just stay involved. We'd love to have you. So thank you all for coming.
Sadly enough, we hire by promotion.
Yeah, I've heard a lot about it, and I've just always been thinking, like, I need to figure out how to get in there. Oh, wow.
You work actually on a break.
So are you hiring students that are still obtaining their degrees, or?
Usually they're undergrads.
Oh, great, yeah, because I'm transferring. No, so I'm transferring from Front Range, like, for the spring, so I'll start there in the spring. So yeah, and I intend on being
Good to see you.
How are you doing?
Oh, that's wonderful. Okay.
I'm getting out of the job.
All kinds of stuff. Yeah. Yeah, I understand, yeah. Oh, definitely. Definitely. Yeah, well, I mean, that's great because I end up I'm doing 2 minors with my major, so I'll probably be there for at least 3 more years, at least. But yeah, I'd love to come check it out maybe in January or something like that. But I'll send you an email and I'll be in touch definitely. Well, I'd love that. Yeah, definitely. Oh, I'm sure. Well, Gayle, it was great to meet you again, Brandon Sandoval. I'll talk to you soon, okay? Thank you.
How do the prices compare between the
Caesar Stushnoff and all those guys, yeah, in the past, more so. I would probably just, like Giannis Minas is in the horticulture department. He works a lot on fruit crops, but it's more cultivation kind of issues. And it's with mostly Western. So he's not a local Fort Collins guy. So usually I run into Scott's going over all these things. As far as the Fort Collins person goes, he's the one I know. That's all his, that's himself. Yeah. Right, who's doing that? Yeah. Scott's going to be the contact person. Scott has done more than anything else. Scott's handed me random trees. We've done some random trees around Fort Collins. So, my husband knows. Through the Wyoming project. So I got tagged out. But I think Scott's really more. And then it was like, in terms of what's known out there and what listing trees are around and who's got them and what's going on, that's going to be Scott. Yeah, who's the point person for that? Do we have all the pieces? Well, there's also someone, I don't think her name. So then I had to bring them in. I said, no, we are going on a certain time. I do a really bad job of getting all that stuff because fall is the big apple season. So that's when I'm going internationally for apples. And I just get caught, I'm traveling all of September and October every year because I'm doing these other projects. I mean, it's really fun, but it just ruins my falls and Fort Collins. So poor Waterworks, I've been out there right now and I feel bad. There's a niche there. There's a total niche for someone because I don't see it in my job, but I'm stretched so thin. I got to be careful. Really, and it's just one tree. So I write environmental reports. So I'm exhausted when I get home. Yeah, and then I follow my homework every night. I mean, it just never ends. My kids are in there, we always do homework together. It's always fun. But Scott's a good point person, but again, he's got a full-time job. CSU, you can always ask the horticulture department, just because this department chairs and see, they do have a specialty crops guy, and he's pretty awesome. He's more on the vegetable side. He's kind of Frank Stoneker's. So they have some people around. I've run into, I forgot her name, but I was a technician I've run into one out there. She's up in Wyoming. So she's peripherally interested and involved, but she's a technician working on research and stuff. She's curious and interested. So unfortunately, unfortunately, we have a lot of us that are all like peripheral entries, and we don't necessarily have a center point. I mean, I know Scott because he's the one who knows, everyone knows Scott. I mean, all those people, if people have talked about, you want to know what their old apples are, they can probably talk to Scott. Now, honestly, I call Scott. Because he's that, I feel like he's the ground guy. I feel like I'm the DNA person and he's the ground guy. And
But specifically things in the past years, what I think you should do is prune your trees so that it just progresses a little each year, and then it progresses, and then it just the historic crab apples are more like a golf ball. And there's actually one region right next to the region building that is a amazing tree, and it has crab apples, you know, that are not like what you think are crab apples. And it was probably planted before years. Well, that was great.
All right, good to see you.
so we're talking about okay. And now there are many things
I want to ask Gayle, does anybody go back to Kazakhstan, which was the area? Yeah, like, does she go back? Because that's where they usually, that's where apples were first found, I think.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure they do, because I read a paper recently that was, I have it on my copies here, but it was talking about the genetics of apple, like what happened during domestication. It's pretty cool papers. And I believe that they were still going back and doing like reconnaissance trips to try to get the source material.
Poppy Desire, I still remember that, the description of hillsides where no one tree looked like any other tree.
Yeah, because of ridiculous outcrossing behavior. No, that's part of the world I've never visited either. I have no idea what the culture looks like.
It's not a loving
fraud.
place.
Yeah. That is quite, I mean, their collections forms the basis for like pretty much everything that we know. We're trying to do this comparative genetics, figure out anything. Since the book sleuthing that you described sounds very difficult.
I love the guy who makes the cider just stopping at a tree and collecting. And I was thinking, oh my gosh,
yeah,
I learned early in Colorado, you better ask ahead of time.
Yes.
I tell lots of people
so you can get yourself into ditch and really quickly.
I've had, in several instances, we've had people come after us with shotguns.
For this is like collecting for...
We were collecting pine cones.
Oh, right.
But we had these long things with hooks on them.
For your single leaf, the Pinus edulis?
Ponderosa. Does anybody go back to...
Oh! And I'm planning to go back again next year. I'm very actively.
What's the research like there? Like how do they use history or sort of how do you
They are, it's actually so much messier than what we can ever talk about it. Because there's a story, and it's actually a really big deal there. The Soviets planted their old Russian cultivars in the apple forest. So the apple forests are completely contaminated.
That's what we did in Buffalo here.
Yeah, this is what we did. And this is the, it's actually a lot of the very scary stuff that we've got in our national collections is hybridized mixed stuff. So I'm in the process of cleaning up that mess, genotyping all those trees, figuring out which ones are pure and which ones are domestic hybrids. Thankfully, I can tell the genetics. So that's all these great tools to clean it all up. But they're in the process of trying to build conservation projects.
I'm gonna get some potato wedges.
People were starving. This is like the 1950s and 60s. People are very hungry. You need to produce fruit. There's not very many places like Kazakhstan that grow fruit. And the apples have a band in the mountains at a certain elevation where all the trees are. So why not plant the cultivars in these forests where they want to grow? And it's the perfect conditions. So we are actually working with them to build conservation strategies in the country, in the national parks. They're building conservation orchards to try to bring them back some of their stuff. So if we say it's clean, they're taking it back to Kazakhstan and putting it in their orchards because they know it's cleaner. They're targeting things in the field and training students, and they've got a big student training program there at Caspian University to go out and characterize what's there, document where these orchards are, because when you go in these national parks, they're like, look how beautiful our wild apples are, and I'm like, they're in rows. Pay attention, guys. Exactly. I mean, they're all the same age and they're all in rows. Let's keep walking, keep walking, keep. I know they're beautiful. Keep walking.
trees, I think.
So yeah, it's an interesting project. It's a huge project, and it's a lot of work. But they have an extreme amount of money. Just people in Kazakhstan. So he's decided to take on his yeah, he's from Mineral Resources and is now taken on the story.